brothers, do you recall when the grasslands reached to the horizon? And the deafening roar of countless wings overhead. Back when Rome was a village and Britain the Emerald Island. Before we gave up on our future and buried our dead.
Okay, guys, so I guess we're starting our episode 17 and we're doing Hittites today. And I would like to open up the episode with a couple memorial announcements. First of all, very recently, from COVID in Russia, a great scientist and archaeologist, Gennady Borisovich Zdanovich, has passed away. He was the leader of the Archaim excavation that we were talking about. When great scientists go, there's not that many of them. And when they go, it's always a great loss, I think, to everyone involved. But COVID is definitely taking lives, and it's no joke. He has done a lot with excavations of the Archaim. He was the one who originally saved the site from being used for commercial purposes. He has been through hell and back trying to defend the site because there have been a lot of speculations. I just want to honor his memory. Another person that I want to honor in this episode is going to be my personal hero, and that's Vyacheslav Vsevolodovich Ivanov, who passed several years ago. He is probably one of the greatest linguists Indo-Europeans I have ever known. He was a walking encyclopedia. The man spoke something like 120 languages, including Luvian, Hittite, and many other Anatolian languages, extensively researched in the European and in the Iranian languages, spoke a lot of them fluently, wrote poetry, wrote texts in both languages, was one of the 5 people in the world who could speak fluently in those languages. A great mind. I'm using a lot of his material for this episode. He has done an invaluable amount of work in helping understand the Hittite texts. So I just wanted to honor those 2 scientists. So it's episode 17. A shout out goes to Marwan as always. And guys, if you're watching this episode and if you like what we're doing, please like. It makes a big difference. And if you hate it, of course, go ahead and dislike. But the likes do help the show quite a bit. And I appreciate everybody who keeps coming back and listening. And I appreciate all the subscribers. I hope you're enjoying what we're doing. And I want to start this episode with a quote. And it is the quote from the will of one of the first recorded Hittite kings, Hattusili I. And of course, this quote has been shrunk down and edited, but here it goes. Look, here's my son, Mursilis. Take him as your king. Seat him upon the throne. The god has filled his heart with so much, for only a lion can take a lion's place. If times of trouble or war come upon him, be his strength and his support. Even though, due to his tender age, he is not able yet to fulfill the duties of a king, honor him, for he is the light of my own son. And if he, at his young age, must go to war, bring him safely back. Let our ranks be as one, like a pack of wolves. We all share a single liver. We all breathe with a single breath, hear with a single ear. There is no place for quarrel amongst you. None of you have the right to turn against another. Those of you who know my words and my wisdom, carry them to my son, so that he too can grow up to be wise. No one before now has received my soul from me. You, Mursilis, my son, I'm passing my soul on to. If you keep to my words and eat only bread and drink only water, you will grow up. Then you may eat as much as you wish without limit. And when you reach old age, then feel free to drink your fill. Only then can you disregard your father's words. And I really like this quote because it's very telling. The reason why I've been so excited to do the Hittites and the reason why Hittites to me are so interesting and so they are very few kingdoms, very few cultures, and those very ancient times are as close to us, as understandable to us as the Hittites are. Hittites, even though they lived such a long time ago, it's something like 2700 BC plus or minus, and to the Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BC. they are not that different from me and you. They're very comfortable, very familiar to the modern European and near European cultures. They're very modern in their own way. They're very progressive in their own way, and yet it is the oldest, most archaic in the European language that we actually have a record of. So who are the Hittites? Let me pull up my map. So at its height, the empire of Hatti, the Hittite empire as we call them. Now there's going to be some confusion with the names here. Occupied a big chunk of Anatolia. When they arrived to Anatolia, and it's a big question how they arrived there, there were already people living there. And I want to talk a little bit about the people who lived there before the Hittites in the European migrants arrived there. Now, the name Hittites themselves was taken from the name of what Hittites eventually made there to be their capital, and that's the city of Hattusa. Before them, another peoples, the peoples who were already populating this entire middle area, people who also call themselves Hatti, based on the name of the same capital, Hattusa, used to live there. Next to them were living the Kaska people, and there is some questions about who these people may have been. Now, the Cherkess nation, there's some speculation that their language may be related to the Hatti language. Now, we have quite a bit of the Hatti language left, but there's a problem with interpreting it. The reason why we have the Hatti language left is because when the Hittites arrived to the Hatti lands, they kind of overlaid the Hatti. They didn't exterminate them. They didn't subjugate them as much as they intermixed with these people. And their language was parallel to the Hatti language for a very long time throughout their history. So a lot of the documents that Hittites originally wrote were written in both Hatti and Hittite languages, but they were using either the Akkadian or later on the Assyrian scripts, which were the cuneiform scripts, which were absolutely not adapted for transliterating the Hatti language, because the Hatti language falls into the Caucasian language family, the Adigo-Abkhasian language family. The other people, the Kaska people that lived along this region, they remained in and out of the Hittite influence throughout their history. They were wild tribes, kind of like Picts, versus Brits later on in Britain. They were the tribes that constantly rebelled. That were very warlike, were very not easily subdued. They also, it is believed, spoke some echoes or some version of an Adigo-Abkhasian language group or Kartvelian language group, which those language groups, there's a huge debate on how related they are. Now, the Kartvelian language group, it's actually the Georgian language, modern-day Georgia, country of former Soviet Union, not Soviet Union anymore, very much independent. But those languages have some distant relations. They're both from the mountains of Caucasus, and it is believed that this whole region was settled by the people from the mountain of Caucasus, the Caucasian people, not in the sense that we're using it in our passports and documents, meaning white person, but actual Caucasian people from Caucasus. The Hatti substrate occupied the entire central southeastern Anatolia. They were city-states, like kind of loose tribal formations when the Hittites arrived. The land was not terribly occupied, it was only partially occupied. So the Hittites overlaid right on top of these people. And it is quite a bit more is known about Hatti because a lot of the religious rites that the Hittites later practiced and written down actually come from the Hatti practices. But the thing is, when the Hittite scribes were transcribing the Hatti texts, they were transcribing them later on in the history of Hittite Empire. They no longer even remembered how the language sounded or what it meant. So they were copying symbols without understanding what the symbols actually meant. And when you do that without understanding what they mean, the chances of you actually transmitting any sort of meaning are almost zero. So what we have really left of these people are, individual names and some names of locations, toponyms, and not much of anything else. But based on those words, it is kind of guessed that they were probably of the Caucasian origin, of the Adigo-Abkhasian origin. Another peoples that were living in this region were the Luvites. Luvites were also in the European. This is another map. They would be right here. Okay.
Well, they were originally more up
Okay.
here.
That's what I understand. Okay, so the Luvites were in this area. The Luvites were in the European speakers that we don't know very much about their language remains, but they are related to Hittites. But me and David were discussing on the way here that there's a good chance that they might have been early migrants to the region. We don't know that. Another group that was living in this region were the Mitanni group. Mitanni were definitely in the European speakers, and they were very warlike people. Now, we will talk about the specifics of the Hittite culture, but the Mitanni culture, it seems that they were later, they departed from Aryan voyage, from the place where all the Aryans used to live, later than the Hittites. This is speculation, but this is speculation that I'm strongly partial to. But they arrived nonetheless to the territories earlier than the Hittites did, possibly because they took a different route. They came from the east. And so they organized into a state before the Hittites organized into a state, even though they departed the homeland later. They had fairly developed Vedic tradition. They also seem to have brought with them, the fully developed art of horses and using horses and chariots. And it seems that originally the chariots most likely were brought to this region by the Mitanni. At least that's one of the versions. Let's see, what else am I missing? They had already such gods as Mithra and Varuna in their pantheon, to where Hittites did not have any of those, the later well-known Vedic gods. The Mitanni also had the Varna system, where you had your warrior, your priest, your warrior, and then your commoners classes, something that Hittites also did not seem to have. They arrived somewhere around about 3000 BC. And their capital, Vishugana, has never been discovered. So hopefully, maybe one day it will still be discovered if people ever stop having war in that region. So our Hittites most likely came through the Balkans. There's good indication that they left the Balkans around 2700 BC, and there's a good indication that they did not bring chariots with them as much as they brought carts, and they may have or may have not had horses. But some of the earliest, the earliest known in the European language that we have written down to date is really the Hittite language. It has some very archaic traits. For example, it does not have a separation between masculine and feminine. It also doesn't have some of the other features of, later in the European languages. It's fairly easy to learn and read for modern, European language speaker. But they did use the Akkadian script to write down their text with, which is very fortunate, because when their huge archive, their big state archive was found, and by that point in time, the scientists already knew how to read both Akkadian and Assyrian. They were able to very relatively quickly, basically decipher and understand this language as soon as they figured out that it was an Indo-European language. They had no Vedic tradition. They had none of the typical gods that we see from later Aryans, whether that's Persians, whether that's Celts, whether that's, Germanic, Slavic populations, or, the Aryans who wound up in India. It seems that they traveled with their entire families when they traveled. And for that reason, rather than their language being lost and dissolved in the local population, it seems to have overlapped the local population. There are very few physical remains of these people found, and almost none of physical remains that can be definitely and absolutely identified as specifically Hittite versus local, Aborigine population. And they practice cremation. And so that's pretty good explanation as to why we probably don't have very many remains left. They overlaid the local peoples quite a bit, and they did not actually call themselves Hittite. Hittite is what their neighbors called them. What they actually called themselves was based on the name of their original capital, because Hattusha became their capital much later on. They actually called themselves by the name of Nisili, and the name Nisili was based on the way that what they called their language, Nessa, and that was also what they called their original capital city, the city of Kadesh. Which was a big trading colony originally, in Assyrian and other peoples were living there. A lot of Hittites were living there before they even organized into an empire or any sort of a kingdom. Their first king, by the name of Anita, actually sacked and took Hattusha, which was somebody else's fort. And I'm going to show you some pictures of Hattusha real quick. And he destroyed it, and he claims that he had planted some nastiness there, whether salt or some sort of weeds, and he cursed the place for eternity, and so that nobody may live there. Well, his kingdom fell shortly thereafter, I think during his successor's time, and it took some time for the Hittites to reorganize into any sort of an organized state-type formation. But it's funny that they made their capital city Hattusha, the very city that their original king that they took as their original king actually cursed and wanted nobody to ever live at. So Hattusha was a very impregnable fort, and it's located about 1,000 meters above sea level. It is in a fairly droughted area, which around the near the river of Kizil, modern name Kizil, but there is not direct water storage there except for 7 springs. That was what fed the city. It's a very high elevation, fairly impregnable. The city itself was discovered in 1906, 1907. It's when the archive of Hattusha was discovered. And there was about 30,000 clay tablets were discovered. What happened is when the city was sacked and burned, this is an artist's representation of what it may have looked like at its heights. This is an actual location where they take the tourists to take a look at the city. It was a fortress, and a big one. I believe it only had 8 gates that would be closed off every night and sealed with special clay seals to make sure no spies made it into the city. When it was actually discovered, the archive has been burned, and because it has been burned, all those clay tablets, they actually got baked, and that's why they got preserved for us rather than just deteriorating in the ground. But they found 30,000 individual tablets. And that's the largest massif of any sort of ancient text that we have. We probably know more about the Hittite Empire than we know about all the other empires, including the Egyptian Empire. And we know it from their own words. I'm just went a little bit too far here, but well, I might as well just show you. I mean, this is some of their jewelry that I found images of. They had very developed technology. They were absolutely outstanding warriors. As all Indo-Europeans, they were in love with their chariots. And the way that they got their chariots is they went to war with the Mitanni kingdom again and again until they finally weakened it and it kind of fell apart. But they borrowed and learned the chariot technology from the Mitannites. And actually there survives in their archive is a treatise on how to, raise and how to train your horses for chariot purposes. That was, according to their records, was written by Mitanni, professional Mitanni horse breeder and trainer by the name of Kikuli. And it's known as the Treatise of Kikuli the Mitanite. First one ever on horse husbandry. What the Hittites did is that they improved their chariots because originally the chariots had their wheels towards the back of the actual device, and that kind of provided less stability. What the Hittites did is they moved their axle towards the middle of the chariot, and that allowed for more stability, and that allowed them to have as many as 3 people in their chariots at a time. It's really hard to find any accurate representation of these guys as anything really. There seems to be a lot of speculation about them and very little, I mean, this is a rather small representation, but you kind of get the idea. They could have as many as 3 warriors on there, so you would have one person who would be the chariot driver, and then you would have 2 warriors there that could either fire arrows or throw other projectiles, or could hop up the chariot and take on their enemy. Their chariots were absolutely the best in the region at the time, and they moved their axle a little bit forward, and that allowed for more stability. The first clue that there was something like this, other than the Bible, and we'll talk a little bit about the Bible towards the end, but the very first clue that there was some Indo-European something in that area actually was found in 1887 when, I need to admit someone, in 1887 when the Amarna archive was found in Egypt, and that is the city of Akhenaton, of the king who tried to instill the single god religion in Egypt. And when his city got destroyed, his archive was partially left in place, and when his archive was found, some of the tablets, 2 of the tablets were written in the same very familiar Assyrian script, but in a language that nobody at the time could decipher or understand. And one of the scientists actually proposed that it might have been an Indo-European language, but kind of got laughed out of that idea and stopped proposing that rather swiftly. But later on, when the Hattusa archive was actually discovered, it turned out that those two tablets that were originally found in Egypt were also Hittite tablets and a part of the royal correspondence between the two courts. So, a very talented Czech scientist. At the time, he wasn't a scientist. He was a soldier in World War I. And I'm going to try to pronounce his name without messing it up, but it's Gedrzej Grozny. Deciphered the language. He was deciphering it, under enemy fire in World War I in the trenches. And he finally deciphered the language around 1917. And the way that he was able to decipher the language is very interesting. He noticed some words. There was a phrase in the tablet that he was trying to decipher that looked really familiar to it. Now, in Russian language and Slavic languages, there's such a word as yesi, and it's something like is or now. In English language, it's in Czech language, it's in a lot of languages. So that this phrase started with yesi. Then there was a word that he didn't recognize, and then there was a Sumerian word used, and that was a Sumerian word for the word bread. So now something bread, and then he saw something that looked like ate or ati, and then the word water. And he guessed, what if water actually means water? Because water in English obviously is water. In the Russian, it's voda. In Czech, it's also very similarly sounding. It's an Indo-European word. So he said, okay, what if that's the word water? And that's where he started with. And yesi meaning now. And then so something now, bread, something water. And the ati, he translated as drinking. So the phrase actually later on, when the actual script was deciphered, turned out to mean, now you're eating my bread and drinking my water. And that was a common ritual phrase that a king used when talking to his subjects, basically saying that you're on my land and you're using my resources. But that's how it started. And it's funny how similar Hittite almost sounds to modern day Indo-European languages. And of course, I've mentioned earlier in the opening moments of this episode, Vyacheslav Ivanov, who did a great job of, he spent his lifetime deciphering Hittite texts, and he contributed greatly to the deciphering of the texts. The Hittites themselves, as I mentioned, did not call themselves Hittites. They called themselves Nessa or Nesili. But the reason why we know them as Hittites is because the foreign powers called them Hittites. Well, the foreign powers called them Hittites because the rulers of the Hittite kingdom, when they would sign diplomatic documents, they would sign it as Lugar Nur Hati. Lugar being a Sumerian word for ruler. We remember that from talking about the Epic of Gilgamesh. But it was basically the ruler of the land of the Hatti. And so all the foreign powers just referred to them as the Hittites or the Hattites. So, for example, the Egyptians called them, let me see, I have it written down somewhere. The Egyptians actually just called them Hatti. The Assyrians called them Madhati. So everybody just called them Hatti, though Hatti is actually a separate tribe of people. It's kind of a weird and confusing thing. They were a huge opponent of Egypt during the Mid and New Kingdoms. We will get to the battle at Kadesh here in a minute. They used originally Akkadian, but later on switched to the Norse Babylonian version of cuneiform. And that's after they conquered Babylon. What they did is, being Hittites, they rolled up to Babylon, conquered it, looted it, and went home. And left the Babylonians going, what just happened to us? Now that happened before actually the Babylonian kingdom fell to Assyrian conquest. Later on, they butted heads with Assyria quite a bit. Assyria was a common threat that both Babylonian kingdom, the Egyptians and the Hittites all faced. And we will talk a little bit more about that when we get to those kingdoms. They had over 1,000 gods in their capital, 8 gigantic temples, but they had a lot of gods because what would happen is every time, in the Europeans in general, whenever they come and conquer peoples, you will see that later with Persians, oftentimes they incorporate their local customs and their local deities into their own pantheon. And so the pantheon of the Hittites was each conquest kept growing and growing and growing until it got completely confusing and nobody could figure out what god was which. And it's fairly hard for that reason to figure out which gods the Hittites brought with them, which gods they inherited from the locals. Their main god seems to have been a god of thunder, which is kind of proto-Vedic tradition, but that's the god that seems to be referred to the most. And of course, their chief female deity was, you guessed it, Ishtar. Ishtar will live a long and fruitful life, and she is going to be a very prominent goddess throughout human civilization, pretty much up until Christianity came and destroyed all that. Ishtar is one of my favorite deities in the world. I mean, they had so many deities, it's hard to even say which one, pinpoint which one was most important. I mean, yeah. But I mean, she had a different name during different times, but Ishtar is still Ishtar. No, she was also known as Ishtar at times. The Hittite kingdom lasted about 600 years plus or minus, so there was some fluctuation in names. The interesting thing about the Hittites is that they were probably the most gender equal peoples of their region and of their time. The women had almost equal rights to men. For example, if a Hittite female wanted to go and fight in a war, she wanted to be a chariot driver, gods be your friends, and off you go fighting. If a Hittite woman wanted to get a divorce, she could do so. If Hittite queens had a very important and prominent place in their power structure, to the point where they had their own diplomatic court and handled their own diplomatic independent correspondence with foreign powers, and we will encounter some of that later on. Today, of course, the site of Hattusha, it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The city was so big that in the middle of 2000 BC, it was larger than either Babylon or Nineveh, which was the capital of Assyria. So it was the largest city in that region at the time. It was a huge city. And, we are very, very grateful to the Hittites for using a script that our scientists are able to easily deciphering, rather than using some spiral writing or some square writing or some upside down writing like a lot of other people did. And the fact that they did keep meticulous records and detailed. They did not seem to, their royal records were almost, newspaperish. They were very journalistic in nature. I mean, they kept everything. They kept foreign correspondence. They kept personal, sayings by the kings. They chronicled all of their, palace coups and all of their troubles, all their wars, all their conquests, all of their perturbations, death, marriages, birth, all that stuff, all the court intrigues, everything. We know just about everything about them. I mean, everything that survived gives us quite a bit of information. So, anybody wants to interject before we jump to the kings?
Quick question. Sorry for coming to the video late, but the German officer or soldier that in World War I did some translation. Do you know what theater of operation he operated in?
He was Czech, and I do not.
Okay.
Yeah, he was Czech. He was not German. But I assume they were part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire at the time, weren't they? Yeah.
Okay.
So they would have been where Austro-Hungarian Empire would have been, I assume.
Sure.
So
yeah, I was just curious if he was operating in the Middle East.
I don't believe so. No, I don't believe so. I don't know that for a fact. I will put his name on the podcast, and we can probably look that up. So Hittite Empire is broken into, the Old Kingdom, the new, the Middle Kingdom, the New Kingdom, and the Neo-Hittite period. I'm going to just name the most prominent kings. Of course, the King Anita was about 18, and the dates are very rough. I'm mostly naming because there's some disagreements about the chronology to use. There's short chronology, long chronology, middle chronology, a whole bunch of other chronologies, as many chronologies as you want. But for me, the dates are more interesting in the sense of how long these rulers remained in place, rather than trying to pinpoint the exact years of their rule. So the first king that was kind of pre-Hittite Empire, he ruled out of Kadesh, which was the capital at the time and was capital on and off. He was the one who originally destroyed and cursed Hattusha. His name was Anita, and it was about 18 to or maybe 1700 BC. After him came Hattusili I, also known as Tabarna. That's the king whose will I just read an excerpt from to you. Tabarna later on became a title for the kings of Hittites, and which is commonly used title. He ruled about 16 and he was the first king who kind of united the kingdom. But him really, the Hittite kingdom begins as such. He conquered the Hattusha, he conquered North Syria, and he ruled from about right around 1650, 1620 BC. After him followed an era of endless coups where different rulers were replacing each other. One was murdering each other and taking the throne, until we come to the roughly around 1408, 1386, and that is it's gonna take me a minute to pronounce this name. Suppiluliuma. And this is an important guy. He's kind of a big character. He was the guy who came in at the time when the Kashgars, those wild tribes that were living off on the edges of the empire, once again rebelled. And they rebelled in such force that they overran the capital. They killed a lot of the citizens. They sacked the capital. And so he came to power on the wave of that devastation and that tragedy that was all around him. He was definitely a very despotic character, a very despotic ruler. His brother, who was not as well suited to the role, he killed his brother when he came to the throne. And he conquered everything. I pretty much have it written down as conquered everything because that's what he did. He is the one who brought the Hittite Empire to that, to its uttermost size before the very last Hattusili. So, and he was a formidable warrior. He was a great warrior. He was much, feared and revered all around. He did an unthinkable thing during his rule. Now, as I mentioned, the queen herself was a very prominent figure in the kingdom and in the empire. The queen was elected and appointed by the way that the Hittite Empire worked is that it was kind of a feudal society where the king is just the greatest among his equals. He couldn't really traditionally rule without the support of the other nobles. The nobles had a lot of freedom. This was a lot like the Polish organization later on. They could veto him. They had different nobles had the right of veto. The king had a hard time going to war, gathering his troops, or doing anything without noble support. And among other things, the queen was also the king proposed the queen, and then the nobles decided whether or not the queen was right for the king. And the queen oftentimes ruled past the time, even if the king himself had died, the queen continued ruling, even though a new king has taken the throne and had his own wife. The former queen still continued to be the queen until the end of her life, and she had a very strong faction behind her, and that caused a lot of the turmoil and unease within the empire during the time of the coups and even later on. Well, Suppiluliuma did an unthinkable thing. He wanted to strengthen his alliance with the state of Babylon. He wanted to take a Babylonian bride, but he already had a wife. And so what he did is he sent his wife, the mother of his children, 5 children, away. He exiled her out of the state and took a new Babylonian wife. This was an unthinkable thing. During his conquests, he received a very strange letter, and here, this is a very well known. It was a letter he could not even believe, because he had some conflicts with Egypt. They were already having some, tension with Egypt. Egypt is going to be somewhere in this area, so there were tensions around this area back and forth. Suddenly, he receives a letter, and here's the letter that he received. The letter was from the Egyptian queen, an Egyptian queen. My husband is dead, and I have no son. People say that you have many sons. If you send me one of your sons, he will become my husband, for it is repugnant to me to take one of my servants as a husband. And when he received that letter, he scratched his head and he said, "What? This is a letter from the Queen of Egypt, and she wants me to send my son to do what?" Bottom line is he did not believe her. He basically sent one of his messengers back, to check the situation out and see if this was a trap of some sorts. Basically saying, "Is this a joke? Are you trying to, pull one on me?" Well, the messenger arrived in Egypt, and of course, during those times, they considered their winters to be very cold. I don't know how cold they actually were comparing to our climate here, but to them, they were cold. They usually did not do much traveling or war during those months. Well, when his messenger, who traveled to Egypt came back, he brought the following letter from the queen. "Why do you say they are trying to deceive me? If I had a son, should I write to a foreign country in a manner humiliating to me and to my country? I have written to no other country. I have written only to you. They say that you have many sons. Give me one of your sons, and he will be my husband and lord of the land of Egypt. And at this point in time, the king believed this message. And it was too tempting, really, of an offer for him to turn down. Because if his son could become the pharaoh of Egypt, I mean, can you imagine how much our history would have changed? And so he decides to send one of his middle sons to Egypt. And he puts together this wedding party, and he sends his son. Well, what queen are we talking about? There is some discussion whether or not this queen was the wife of the king, one of the later wives, not Nefertiti, but one of the later wives of the king Akhenaton. But most scientists agree that she was most likely the wife of the boy king Tutankhamun, who was murdered early on. And I'm sure most of you remember that, Akhenaton had this whole religious reform that a lot of the Egypt opposed. And when he died, his son came to the throne, and a lot of Egyptians wanted to move things back to how they were. And the boy king, whose tomb was later found and that now goes on display in all the great museums with all the magnificent gold, he died young. Well, his widow most likely was the one who was writing to the king of Hittites. There was a general at the time in Egypt who had a very strong faction behind him. And there's a good chance as what happened is while the king of Hittites was thinking, while his son was traveling, because quite a bit of time has passed, that the general forced the queen to marry him. Bottom line is, when the son arrived on Egyptian territory, before he even got very far into it, he got murdered. And of course, back at home in, Hittite capital Hattusa, Suppiluliuma was waiting anxiously of the news of his son's safe arrival. And when he heard that his son was dead, and what the new king of Egypt wrote back to him is that your son has died, but I have nothing to do with it. He was devastated. He was very devastated. He was angry. He wrote, "What have you done with my son? Concerning the fact that no blood has been spilled between us before, the blood spilled since between us is not right." And he went to war. He went to war with Egypt's Syrian vassals in Palestine. And he was quite successful. He devastated the territory. He brought back quite a few prisoners. The problem is, with prisoners, he brought back a serious plague from Egypt. And this plague devastated the land of Hatti for the next 20 years. As a result of this plague, the king himself died. His heir died. And so a very young boy at the time, his youngest son, came to the throne. This man's name was Mursili II, and he ruled about 1321 to 1295. This man ruled for a long time, and his life was not an easy life. When he came to the throne, he had several problems to deal with. His country is being devastated by plague. I mean, his father was a very victorious, very successful warrior, but he had died. His older brother has died. He is a young man, not very experienced at war. Other kings were writing to him saying, "You're a boy, we're not afraid of you. Your father was strong and he had many soldiers, but you now have no soldiers and you're a child, so who are you to tell us anything?" He also had his mother, stepmother, the Babylonian queen, now sitting on the throne next to him, and she was a thorn in his side. He did not like her, she did not like him, and his country was continuously ravaged by plague. At one point, he married quite successfully to a woman he apparently really loved, but she too was taken away by plague. And this man for 20 years suffered nothing but devastation and desperation, desperation and devastation. Nonetheless, he held the empire together. He managed to reconquer some of the lands that the empire lost as a result of the plague, even though his land was practically just laid bare as a result of this illness. And one of the things that we have, that is preserved from his time is his prayers for the sake of his people to the gods, to spare his people and to spare his land. And I really want to read these to you because they tell you a lot about these people and what they were like. "You gods, my lords, have watched over my father, and the land of Hatti prospered, and he conquered many lands. And all was well during his rule. But so it happened that you gods decided to punish my father for Tudhilia's death, Now Tudhilia was the brother that his father killed when he came to the throne. And my father died because he had spilled the blood of Tudhilia. And the princes and field commanders and the courtiers who supported his deed all died for it in the same manner. And the curse fell onto the whole Hatti land, and the Hatti land is dying. And the plague ravages our land. Fewer and fewer people are left alive. Heavy toll the plague takes upon Hatti. I, Mursili, your servant, cannot seem to contain my anguish. I cannot contain the terror in my heart. Have pity on me, my gods, my lords. Those who killed Tudhalis have paid dearly for it. Those who have done these wrongs are long since dead and buried. But my father's curse fell upon me now. Look upon me, gods, hear me. I will pay retribution to save my land from this plague. I will pay you all for my father's sins, everything that's owed. Take pity upon me, gods, my lords. Accept my sacrifices. If the plague doesn't ease, those few priests who still live to sacrifice to you will die too, and there will be no one left to honor you in the Hatti land. I'm going to stop and see if anybody wants to say anything.
Those are called what you just read are called the plague prayers.
It's very interesting. It's very striking, the emotion in the writing, and that level of emotion is very unusual for the time.
Yeah, that's why I'm so fond of, particularly towards the Hittites, because they are so real to us. They're so alive to us. I will read a couple out of their works, but that's because we can read their text and understand them, because it is an Indo-European language that's not terribly far from the languages we speak today, and its grammar, composition, and the way that it, 30,000 tablets is quite a body of text. I mean, we have everything from their laws, and if we later on, we're running out of time and I want to get through this material, but if anybody wants to hang over, I will read you as a bonus some of the I'll read some of the normal laws, but I will read you some of the more interesting laws that they had also, just for entertainment. But I'm going to go ahead and move forward if nobody else has anything to say. So at the time of the rule of Mursili's son, Ramses II, the 19th dynasty came into power in Egypt. And Ramses II, who we will know later is one of the greatest and longest lived pharaohs in Egyptian history, who according to the Bible died, while chasing the Israelites out of Egypt, but he ruled happily thereafter for many, many years, not having a clue that he supposedly died. He wound up going to war with Muwatalli, which was Mursili's son. And that was the famous battle at Kadesh. And I'm sure you probably have heard of it. In this battle at Kadesh, his brother, and this is a very important character in Hittite history, Hattusili III, fought as one of the generals. The battle was a kind of more or less a stalemate. For the longest time, we knew about it, mostly from the inscriptions that Ramses left when he came back from the battle. And, his inscriptions pretty much said that my army didn't defeat anyone. I alone defeated all the Hittites. Me, myself, and I, as a god, would strike down mortals. And I slayed thousands of them, 10,000 of them, single-handedly. It's never been seen before, as a true god should. Well, when we found the archive, it turned out that the story was not quite like that. What happened is young and very impressionable Ramses II, he was fairly more or less a kid at the time, wanted to do glorious war, and so he led 4 of his divisions out there. He got hyper excited, ran ahead of the army, got cut off by the Hittite forces. 2 of his divisions fell altogether behind. 1 of his divisions got completely wiped out. He almost got killed himself, by some miracle managed to save himself. It was a long, drawn-out, bloody battle that was near a stalemate, with the Hittites being a little bit more on top than the Egyptians. This was also the last great, Bronze Age battle that was actually fought with bronze weapons. After that, big battles were really fought with the, iron weapons. One thing I forgot to mention is that Hittites very early on had iron. They had the art of making weapons out of iron, and they guarded it closely. But the way that they did it is along the shores, but they had a lot of meteorite iron. They just washed up there, and a lot. And by a lot, I mean quite a bit. And they figured out how to manufacture it into, weapons and tools, but they didn't really know how to mine it or any of that stuff. They just were picking up available meteorite, iron, and so when that ended, so did the Hittite Iron Age, kind of, in that sense. So Hattusili is the important character here. His brother, who was the ruler of Hittites at the time of the Kadesh battle, passed away, and Hattusili's nephew came to power, and Hattusili and his nephew had some tensions. The nephew was not very well suited for rule. Hattusili thought the nephew wasn't treating his uncle very nice. His uncle was a war veteran, very hardened, very popular among the peoples. When the nephew started taking away land and honors from Hattusili decided he had enough, and he marched on the capital and he overthrew his nephew. Now, he didn't kill his nephew. He actually exiled his nephew. And he became one of the most successful rulers in history of the Hittite kingdom. His years are about 1267 to 1237, that's BC, so that's 30 years of his rule. Along the way, somewhere in his return from Egypt, he came across a priest's daughter, and she's going to play a very prominent role in the story. Her name is Putuhepa, and we should remember this name. Putuhepa was a unique and amazing woman. Hattusili started ruling. Eventually him and Ramses, many years later, got sick and tired of endless skirmishes. Ramses, by the way, never again went to war for the rest of his rule. Egypt after that closed in on itself and had no more expansionist kind of ideations, no more expansionist plans. But eventually him and Ramses wound up concluding a treaty, and that's the most famous treaty in the world. It's the treaty that to this day decorates the the UN building, a copy of it. It's the very first known recorded peace treaty where they agreed to be at peace at all times and be brothers for all times, and for there to be always peace between the two lands. And the reason they did this is because Assyria was gaining strength, and against this threat of very new, very aggressive Assyrian kingdom, the two kingdoms had to unite. And actually their relationship, this peace, lasted on for quite a long time, almost 75 years. It lasted the lifetime of the two kings. The two queens corresponded quite in depth with each other. I have a letter that I want to pull up and I want to read to you real quick. That is actually, because the queens in Hittite Empire could have their own correspondence. We have personal letters from Putuhepa to her counterpart in Egypt, and also to Ramses. We have Ramses' letters to her where he's calling her sister and inquiring after her health and well-being. And we have letters from the Egyptian queen asking about her well-being. So here's a letter from Ramses to the wife of the king, to Putuhepa. The great king, the king of Egypt, son of the sun, Ramses, beloved of Ammon, speaks thus. Speak to the queen of the Hatti land, the great queen Putuhepa. See then, I, your brother, am well. My houses, my sons, my armies, my horses, my chariots, and the things in my land are very well. May you, my sister, also be well. May your houses, your sons, your armies, your horses, your chariots, your nobles, and the things in your land be very well. Speak thus to my sister. Look now. My messengers have come to me together with my sister's messengers, and have brought me the news that my brother, the king of the Hatti land, the great king, is in good health. Speak thus to my sister. The great king, the king of the Hatti land, has written to me thus. Let the people come to pour sweet-smelling oil on my daughter's head, and let them take her to the house of the great king, the king of Egypt, my brother. Look now, my brother wrote this to me. This decision written to me by brother is wonderful. The sun god has approved of him. The weather god has approved of him. And the Egyptian gods and the Hatti gods have approved of him for making this fine decision in order to join the two great lands onto one forever. And as a result of this correspondence, now, of course, Putuhepa, she communicates back and forth with Ramses about the matter. What they're talking about is that the Hittite princess, the daughter of Putuhepa and Hattusili, is going to marry Ramses II. And she does. She enters his household. And she enters it as not, of course, as the senior queen, which was Nefertari at the time, but she enters it as one of the senior queens and actually plays a prominent role at the court. And much later on in life, Ramses actually marries a younger one of Hattusili's daughter as well. So the two great houses of the two great lands join together in marriage. I'm going to stop and see if anybody has anything to say.
Just wanted to say that some of that stuff that you read was kind of a tearjerker, to be honest. Got nothing else, though.
Anyone else? Okay, so Hattusili.
We can't include love stories.
Yes, it does actually. I'm about to go to a love story. So Hattusili, even though he was a great commander and a great ruler, he was in a very frail health from birth. And actually it was foretold that he was not going to live very long. So he was dedicated to a specific goddess, as he is a protector goddess. And he believed that it's due to his patron goddess that he survived as long as he did, but he had bouts of ill health. And by the way, one of the things that Hattusili left behind him is what's known the apology of Hattusili, and it is his explanation as to why he dared to, because in Hittite law it was absolutely wrong to raise your hand against your kin. So he wrote a rather lengthy autobiography explaining how come he overthrew his nephew. And it's not as much an apology as it's really a justification. So it's a document that's known. There's a lot of diplomatic exchange between Hattusili and and Ramses that remains a whole body of documents, both in Egypt and in Hattusha. Also, during his rule, the little story was the city of Velusa, which we talked about in the last episode, aka Troy, is mentioned. And in one of correspondences, the name of Alexandru, which is another name for Prince Paris from the Trojan War, is also mentioned. And also the people of Akiava, the Achaean Greeks, are also mentioned during this time. But eventually, Hattusili fell very ill. And I have a prayer from his wife that is recorded. O sun goddess, I, Puduhepa, your servant, pray to you. Grant me that which I beg for, my mistress, my goddess. I pray to you to grant life to your servant Hattusilis, my husband. May Hattusilis live yet many days, many years. You are the greatest of deities. None can equal you. All the gods heed your counsel and listen to your words. Gather all the gods up and beg them for Hattusilis' life. My whole family and I honor you, and we pray to you. Soften your soul towards us, mistress goddess. Hear me today. Make it so that all the gods hear my prayers. Unfortunately, Hattusilis did pass away. And so he was the last greatest ruler of the Hittite Empire. After that, civil war ensued, shortly thereafter, and the war was Assyria. By the way, one thing that I skipped over is early on, Mursilis, the king who survived, lived through the 20 years of plague. Nonetheless, he managed to conquer the little kingdom of Mitanni and kind of tear it apart. And then the Assyrians came in and took the other half. And the Assyrians were able to learn how to do sieges during that particular war. And they very quickly learned how to take cities. Assyrians were brilliant in that way. We will talk about Assyrians in depth, but around this time they took Babylon, and the Assyrian Empire has gained its strength. And so the war with Assyria began. And then, of course, the Akiava, also the Achaean Greeks, went to war with the Hittite kingdom over what Hittites called Milovata, and what we know today as Milet, which was a major trading city. And the last king, Suppiluliuma, the second of his name, is the last king we have in the records that we find, and that those records just stop abruptly. It seems that he may have died in the invasion of what is known as the invasion of the Sea People, which is a very dark period in the Bronze Age history. It's a part of the Bronze Age collapse that we talked a little bit about last time. Around 1200s BC, he either died or something happened to him. The city of Hattusha seemed to have been abandoned. It's as if all the royals, all the treasures and everything mostly was moved out, everything that was easy to move. And the city afterward was sacked and burned and just destroyed. And only much later, a fort was built by different, by different peoples on that place. And what survived after the Hittite kingdom, the Hittite Empire collapsed, were the Neo-Hittite kingdoms, which prospered for some time after, but and they even had the same ruling dynasty that claimed descendants from the same dynasty, but they were not as prominent. Any comments, anybody? And we're going to run a couple minutes over. Okay, then I'm just going to finish it up now. So before we ever found, the Hattusha archive, we have heard, Western researchers heard about Hittites from the Bible. Hittites are actually fairly prominent in the Bible. For example, Abraham buys the cave, the Machpelah, in which he buries his wife Sarah, from a Hittite by the name of Ephraim, from the city of Hebron. And there's a whole story about how they bargain back and forth because the Hittite wants to give him the cave, but Abraham is saying that he has to own the cave to be able to properly bury his wife, so he winds up paying money for it. Abraham's concubine, by the name of Keturah, was also Hittite. David had a general by the name of Orion, who was Hittite, whom he murdered and took his wife as his for himself. And another one of David's, his right-hand man, Ahimelech, was also Hittite. And it seems in general that Hittite women were very beautiful because over and over and over in the Bible, they are, coveted by the main characters. King Solomon, who had a whole harem, as we all know, and was rather liked women quite a bit. He had several of Hittite concubines and wives, or whatever you want to call them, in his harem. It seems that he studied ethnography that way, generally, by having wives from different tribes. That's a joke I stole from Zubov, who is another religious studies specialist in Russia. Ezekiel mentions, it has a phrase where he names the Hebrew people to be born of a union of Amorites, the Amor people, which were the Semitic people, and Hittites. So actually the prophet refers to Hebrew people as being a child of the marriage between Amorites and Hittites, which is interesting because there's a good chance that there might be some, I don't know, if that harkens to some sort of, long lost ancestral memory, it would be interesting to think that some of the Hittite spirits survived in, the warlike pursuits of the Jewish people. And they're also mentioned in the Iliad by the name of Ketai or Ketoi, and that got proven by science, but beyond the shadow of a doubt. And I just want to close with a quick poem, just a general Hittite poem, and then just read you a couple of Hittite laws, which I think are quite telling. So the poem is about from someone who is sick, and it's not one of the plague poems, it's just from a person who is ill. Our life is bound to death. Our death is bound to life. None of us can live forever. Our years are numbered. If we were given the chance to live eternally, then illness could not come and wreak havoc upon our lives. Now that I have fallen ill, my home is a house of grief. The more I worry, the more the walls are closing in. Tears like droplets of rain burrow holes in the roof. It seems I've been sick for years. I have been sick for decades. Sorrow grows in my heart, making my sickness get worse. At night, I'm laying in bed, restless, unable to sleep. Only bad thoughts come and find my bedside in those dark hours. And I think it's something that we've all experienced before, that misery of illness and hopelessness, especially if somebody's severely ill. So, any comments before I go over just a couple of the Hittite laws?
You mentioned Mursili I. In 1595, he sacked Mary in Babylonia, and then it changed who ruled Babylonia for like the next 300 years. The Kassites would. And now let me kind of skip to the end. Hattusa was burned somewhere between 1200 and 1180, and that is in the middle of that Bronze Age collapse. Possibly by the Kaskas again, possibly by the Phrygians, who were probably Hittite vassals in the west and over towards Troy. Where the Hittites in the Bible come from are after the dissolution, after the falling apart of the Hittite Empire, a lot of little kingdoms that were in Syria were formed that were, they call them Syrio Hittite kingdoms. And they're just little bitty states, but they would last till like the 8th century or something like that, until the Assyrians conquered all before them, basically. And the only other thing is, and you're about to touch on the law, but
Yep.
how advanced that law really was for that time. I'm sure she's about to touch on that. So.
Okay, so are you guys okay? We're going about, I don't know, another 10 minutes or so. So I just want to read some of the laws, from the Hittite law codex. So for example, if somebody harms a man or woman, it says that when somebody harms a person and makes them ill, then they must take care of them. And he must give, instead of the injured person, someone who will work in the house of the injured person until the injured person is better. And when he gets better, the guilty party should give him 6 sickles of silver, and that's a measure of silver. And he also should pay for the doctor. Another law: if due to somebody's fault a free woman births before her time, then the guilty party should pay 20 shekels for the event. If a slave woman gives birth before her time, then they should pay 10 shekels for their fault. So the difference between a slave and a free woman is double, but it's not, that's fairly insignificant in those times. If a free man and a slave woman fall in love with each other, and they will live together, and he will marry her, and they will have their own household and children, but later they either argue or part peacefully and decide to separate their household amongst themselves, then the man must take all the children, but the woman must take 1 child. So the free man takes all the children, but the slave woman, the wife, takes 1 child in her care. Okay, you caught the fact that a free man and a slave woman could marry and then divorce. If a slave man takes a woman who is a free to be his wife, and they have children, and they start to divide their household and property, majority of the children should go with the woman, but only 1 child with the slave. So in other words, if the slave is male and he marries a free woman, then the slave is still responsible for just 1 child because he has less resources, but the free person is responsible for majority of the children. If a slave pays a bride price for a free woman and marries her, nobody can divorce them. So if you marry a slave, you're married for life. If an overseer or a shepherd runs away with a free woman and does not pay the bride price for her, she will become a slave for 3 years. So in other words, if you steal somebody's free woman, somebody's daughter, then she's a slave for 3 years. If somebody finds a kitchen household, like household belongings that belong to someone, he must return it to the owner, and the owner must pay him for the return. But if he does not return the property, then he is considered a thief. So if you find a lost item, you return it. If somebody borrows a bull, a horse, mule, or a donkey, and the animal dies in his care, he must pay for the animal. If somebody, now interesting law on dogs, if somebody hits a shepherd dog and the dog dies, he must pay 20 shekels of silver. If somebody hits a hunting dog and the dog dies, you must pay 12 shekels of silver. If somebody hits a yard dog and the dog dies, then only 1 shekel of silver. So you can see where the shepherd dogs were much more valuable than the household dogs. If somebody rents a bull and hits him, and the owner finds this, then the person who rented the bull has to pay 1 shekel for the damage. So don't hit other people's animals. If a free man commits a theft in a household, then he must return all the belongings unharmed. If he steals a lot, he will have to pay back a lot. But if he steals a little, he will have to pay back just a little. If a free man lights a house on fire, he must rebuild the house. And everything that is lost in the fire, whether that be a person or large animals or small animals or belongings, he must replace. And this is all on the Hittites, and unless you want to stick around for some really lewd law. You guys want lewd laws? If a man sins with a cow, it is a serious crime, and he should be killed. If a man sins with a sheep, it is a serious crime, and he shall be killed. If a man sins with his mother, it is a terrible crime. If the man sins with his daughter, it is a terrible crime. If a man sins with his son, it's a terrible crime. If he comes together with a dead man or woman, it is not a crime. There should be no punishment, and the priest nor the king should be troubled for this. So necrophilia is okay. If a man's wife dies and he marries her sister, there should be no punishment. Then there's an interesting law about what you can do with your wife. If a man has a wife and the man dies, his brother may marry his wife. And if his brother dies, then his father may marry the wife. And if his father dies, then one of his sons or his brother's sons may marry the wife. There will be no punishment. So in other words, she can marry everybody in the family in order.
As long as they're dead.
If a man sleeps with the wife of his brother and the brother is alive, it is a serious crime. If the man has a wife, a free woman, and he sleeps with her daughter, that is also a serious crime. If a man takes somebody else's wife, rapes, outside of household, he is responsible for it and he should be killed. But if he takes her within her household, where she could have shouted for help and otherwise prevented it, then the crime is on her and she should be killed. If the husband finds them, he may kill them both. There will be no punishment for the husband. But if he brings them to the gates of the palace and says, my wife should not be killed, at the same time he grants life to her seducer. But if he says, may they both die, then they need to kneel before the will, and the king can decide what to do with them. If somebody sins with a pig or dog, he should be killed. But the king should not be bothered. If a bull jumps up on a man, the bull should be killed, but the man should not be killed. If a sheep jumps up on a man, the sheep should be killed, but the man should not be killed. Now, if a pig jumps up on a man, there should be no punishment for anyone. And if a man sins with a horse, a mule, or a donkey, there should be no punishment. And he should not bother the king. And he should not bother the priests. And if somebody sleeps with one of the women who's taken in the military campaigns, or her mother, or her sister, or her daughter, there should be no punishment at all. And lastly, if somebody, this is not a lewd one, but still, if somebody sends his son to learn, either as metal worker or smith or fabric maker or any sort of other profession, he needs to pay 6 shekels as payment for this for his teaching. And the teacher will make the son knowledgeable in whatever subject he's knowledgeable in, or otherwise he has to repay the parents back. So those are some of the Hittite laws. And I think that's everything I have today.
I just have to say, I can understand why the king and the priest would not want to be bothered with a lot of that.
Okay, David wants to jump in real quick. Go ahead, Nathan.
Yeah, I think some of those laws would not have gone over very well in Manila.
No.
Not very. Okay, David, just jumping in.
Just want to touch on overall law compared to Babylon, Assyria, Egypt even. These were very progressive laws for the time. They, there were fines and that kind of thing, but there was a lot of reform by various kings along the way. Even the death penalty was used very sparingly, which is really uncommon in that time period. That's pretty much it.
And I must say that women had equal property rights to men, and also the property rights. It's oftentimes believed that in those Eastern kingdoms that the king owned everything, and the subjects kind of just possessed whatever they possessed by the grace of the king. That's not the case with the Hittites. People's property is their individual property. The king it's very much like a feudal society. It's really a feudal society, to where you have this collection of nobles and peasants, and then the king, who's the greatest among the equals, but he's not an all ruler.
And the Pantheas.
Yeah. Yeah, and and I forgot to name it. Another thing is, yes, thank you. So the Hittites had this thing that was called the lanku, which is kind of like sabha. It's like the log sabha in modern Indian parliament. It's something that seems to be an Aryan, basically an Aryan tradition. They could vote the king out. They could judge the king for any crimes they believe the king committed. They could approve or disapprove of his successor, like later on in Poland. For example, a king could only suggest a successor. The lanku had to decide whether or not they were okay with the successor the king nominated. They approved the Tavanana was the name of the queen. They approved the Tavanana's choice. And the king's rights were severely limited by this council, which is fairly unusual for that time in such a developed empire. Now, of course, some of the kings were more tyrannical than others, but as a general rule, that was how it worked out. So I want to put something to vote. Guys, I want to skip Egypt. Is everybody okay with doing that? I think Egypt is absolutely the most covered civilization of all times. I think we all know everything about Egypt. There's a bazillion of documentaries, podcasts, and everything else on Egypt. How would you feel about just skipping Egypt altogether?
I'm fine with that.
Much as I find Egypt interesting, it's pretty easy to find. I'm more interested in the final collapse of the Bronze Age and the Iron Age myself.
Okay, then what we're going to do next time is we're going to cover Babylon and Assyria, because it's crucial to do that, and then probably go to the Bronze Age collapse. Phoenicians. So Babylon and Assyria, then we'll go to Phoenicians, then we'll do the Bronze Age collapse, and then we will, from the Bronze Age collapse, kind of probably through the Greeks, somehow transition to the Scythians, because we need to cover the Scythians. And somewhere in here, we need to jump back in time because we skipped it, and cover the pre-Indo-European Europe, because that's, so I'm probably going to try to attach that to once we start getting into Rome, early Rome, once we start talking about the barbarian. Yeah, so the game plan right now is we're going to do Assyria, We're going to do Phoenicians. We're going to do the Bronze Age collapse. Then we're going to do the Scythians, and then we are going to go to Etruscans.
Mm-hmm.
Does that work for everyone?
You can do the whole Europe.
And if we're missing any important culture, and I like it because it flew out of my head, like wave your hands and arms and legs at me and tell me we're missing it, okay? And it's somewhere in here we need to cover Armenia, which is never covered, which is an absolutely Urartu in Armenia, probably. Once we get into Persian Empire is when we're going to cover Armenia. So that's the game plan. Oh, and David's still preparing China, which I'm not touching because it's terrifying and vast and very, very impressive.
Very vast.
Yeah, so China is going to be kind of its own sub-series. Okay, everyone, next Thursday, same time, same place. It's awesome to have you all here. It's good to see everyone.
Always a pleasure, Julie. Thanks again.
Thanks.
Thanks, love.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you, everyone.
Very well done. Thank you.
Thank you.
Orange glow of a campfire, pale electrical glow. Both cast out shadows as our legends unfold. We are the archetypes that exist within every man's soul. And we will live forever as long as stories are told. We are the archetypes that exist within every man's soul. And we will live forever, or as long as stories are told. We are the archetypes that exist within every man's soul.